if you have a solution that works for a low-income renter who has no time or expertise on these issues, no negotiating power with their landlord, it's going to scale much more easily and it's going to work much better for everybody else. So those are the folks we want to focus on trying to solve the problem for.
I'm Carolyn Parrs, communicator, coach, and host of Just Power, a podcast about creating a clean energy future without leaving anyone behind. Join me as we explore the technologies, policies, and human stories that can make clean energy not just sustainable for our planet, but accessible for everyone. Welcome to the Just Power podcast. Today we're going to dive into the crucial component of our energy transition and a mighty big one, the electrification of our transportation system. No small feat. Joining me today is Jeff Allen, who is the Executive Director of Forth, an organization focused on electrifying transportation. He is a highly regarded expert in this field and has spent over a decade championing inclusive approaches to EV adoption with a strong focus on accessibility for all. Welcome, Jeff.
It's great to be here, Carolyn. Thanks so much.
Right. So good to see you. So Jeff, I'm really curious. I'm going to dive in talking about, like, how did you get involved in EVs and overhauling our transportation system?
Oh my gosh. Now we're going way back.
Okay.
So I sometimes call myself a recovering environmentalist. I've spent most of my career, in fact, all of my career in nonprofit organizations. A lot of it doing environmental policy work and on various issues. But I was always attracted to transportation because, first of all, it's so important, right? It's the second highest household expense for most people. It is key to economic opportunity. One of the statistics we can talk about more, the single biggest predictor of whether a family gets out of poverty or not is commute time. It's huge. And it's also the biggest and fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's very emotional, right? I say all the time, a kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour, right? When you plug your thing in the wall, if it works, you don't really care. But a mile driven in an electric car is a totally different experience than a mile walked or ridden on a bicycle or riding in a bus or whatever. And then finally, it's just frankly, real and relatable. Like when I would talk to people at parties about, oh, I'm working on perchlorobenzene or, you
like
know,
what's that? Right.
Yeah, they've now rebranded as Forever Chemicals, which helps a lot. But still, you know, a little less relevant to people's everyday lives versus transportation, electric transportation. It's almost the opposite. It's like being a doctor, right? I go to a party and people are like, oh, well, I drive a pickup truck, but I recycle and I don't drive it very far. Or they'll ask, oh, well, what electric car should I buy? And I'm thinking about this. It's like, when did I become a car salesman? But it is great to work on something that touches so many aspects of people's lives and is really important to everybody, everywhere.
Yes. You're so right about that with EVs. There's so many questions that people have, and if you've been tracking it, right, because it's progressing, it's evolving, and there's so much more. And now where we are in this particular time politically, it's a whole other question on it, which we'll dive into today.
I'm sure we will. Yeah. And I started with this organization at its very beginning back in 2011. So I've been at this for almost 15 years, specifically on transportation electrification.
Okay.
And it's a totally different world than 2011 was about the time that I think at that point you could buy a Leaf, you could buy the Volt, or you could buy the Tesla Roadster. There was a new startup that had this really weird business model that was called Uber.
Wow.
I mean, we have come a long way.
You have seen a lot in what's happening. So, all right. So you've been around for a while, 2011, well before the current surge of interest, I think. I want to ask, what does energy, we're talking about energy equity today, right? So what does that mean to you and to Forth, the organization? What does it mean?
Yeah, particularly when you apply it to transportation,
Yeah.
I think it's really about access, right? And we, the jargony approach to what we do is targeted universalism. The less jargony approach is sometimes referred to as the curb cut theory. So basically, our approach to this is we want everyone to have access to electric transportation technology, especially the folks who can benefit from it the most, who could save the most money, benefit most from less air pollution, more reliable vehicles, etc. And to do that, we start with the folks who have the most barriers to accessing the technology.
That's smart.
And we do that primarily because that's the best way to design interventions and programs that will work well for everybody, right?
Right.
And the curb cut analogy is you put in the curb cut for people in wheelchairs, but it's really helpful to older folks who might be using a walker, to people who are pushing strollers with babies in them, right? So you do it for the most vulnerable or the people with the most barriers, and it helps everyone. And we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, but in electric vehicles, absolutely true. And my favorite example is multifamily charging, right?
Okay, what does that mean?
So one of the big barriers in electric vehicles is how do you charge your car if you don't have a dedicated parking spot with an electrical outlet? If you have a private home with a garage, it's reasonably easy. You can at least plug it into a wall outlet. Maybe you need to upgrade your panel to put in a charger, maybe not, but still it's relatively easy. But if you live in an apartment or condominium, you might not have a dedicated parking spot, or you might have a dedicated parking spot, but it's nowhere near an electrical outlet.
Yeah.
Or it might be right next to an outlet, but your landlord won't let you use the outlet for a variety of reasons. So this has been a known problem for 10 or 15 years in the EV world, and most people who bought EVs in the past had a home where they could charge because that made it easier. So if you're trying to solve that problem, there are a number of programs out there that work really well if you are a retired engineer who just bought themselves an electric car, right?
Which is the early adopters, right?
Exactly. It's like, hey, here's the...
Got that covered already.
Yeah. And if you solve for those people, you solve for those people. But if you have a solution that works for a low-income renter who has no time or expertise on these issues, no negotiating power with their landlord, if you can solve for them, it's going to scale much more easily and it's going to work much better for everybody else. So those are the folks we want to focus on trying to solve the problem for.
That's really smart to do.
That's our basic approach.
The energy system, I've heard that too, that if we can really figure out really this low income or underserved communities, the rest is easier, right? When we can just build up from there. I'm going to go back a little bit to talk about just transportation and our infrastructure, right? Historically, just like in our energy system, has historically inequitable. It's built that way. I mean, we can go back to the 30s with redlining, and then obviously where the streets are being built, right? Which is very interesting. I read your report. I didn't know that. They were purposefully like through cities to kind of split up what was low-income areas. Wow, that blew my mind. That being said, how are these historical barriers affecting today's electrification efforts?
Yeah, all sorts of different ways. And I think we'll get into this more maybe when we get into how we talk about these issues now. But as you alluded to, one of my pet peeves is you'll read these reports or hear people talk and they say, well, low-income folks are much more likely to live near freeways and major roads. And you think, well, that's dumb. Why did they move there? It's like, no. The truth is low-income people and people of color are much more likely to have had big roads punched through their neighborhoods. They were there first. And regardless of the reasons, we see, if you look at communities now, low-income communities, people of color, this shows up in a lot of different ways. So for starters, much more likely to be in areas with a lot of air pollution, a lot of roads. Much more likely to live in areas without very good transit service or very good bicycle facilities, because that's not where those investments have been made historically. Much more likely to have trouble accessing a vehicle loan. The car loan industry, especially for used cars, is rife with abuse and institutional racism. So that just face a lot more barriers to accessing transportation and mobility. Oh, and also much less likely to have the services that they need nearby, right? So if you heard about food deserts,
Yes.
whole neighborhoods where there is no grocery store and it's hard to access those services. So a lot more barriers that are faced. And again, if you can design programs or design strategies that try and overcome those barriers for those communities, they're going to work much better for other folks too.
Yeah, that's really, really important. And it's just and the engineers you talked that we laughed a little bit about that, but they're the ones that are designing it, right? To really get into the neighborhoods, talk to your communities, see what their problems really are, and then help and then work with them to design what is right and useful for their lives, right? It's so important.
That's the way it should work. Yeah,
I
so
know.
that's a lot of the work.
I'm going to keep on saying it till it comes true. Is that basically what I'm doing?
Yeah, we and I have to give credit to our friends at the Green Lining Institute. We work with a lot. Have this great shorthand of center people, not technology. So there's a lot of talk about where do we put the charging stations, where do we do this, where do we do that. It's like you start with the people who live here and what do they need and what are their transportation mobility needs and how could this technology help meet those needs and what would it take, what kind of support would it take, what kind of intervention would it take for these people to benefit from this technology and design that way rather than kind of dropping things in from above.
Yeah. I do, I do see more of that happening, right? It's happening not maybe as fast as we wish it would, but there are a lot of times municipalities that are, for instance, I'll give a shout out to SMUD, right? Who, that's Sacramento, that have over 200 community groups that they regularly work with. And they call in, not just for electricity, but for food. If they go into someone's home and they open their refrigerator to see if it's working and there's no food in there, right? They bring in some of their partners, which I thought was quite excellent to see some of that movement. But back to EVs, I want to just, what are some of the innovative models that you're seeing for electric vehicle accessibility, maybe even beyond traditional ownership, right? For people that, like you said, that may not have access to a garage that has a place to plug in your vehicle.
Yeah, well, couple of things. Let me back up for a minute and just say, yes, I think a lot of utilities have a lot of experience with this when it comes to helping low and moderate income populations pay their bills, right? Make sure that they don't have to turn the power off. I think you can argue about whether they're doing a good job, and it varies, but it's been an issue they've worked on for a long time. I would say there's very few, if any, utilities that have that level of commitment and investment and expertise around transportation electrification.
Interesting.
Some of it is it's new. Some of it is their regulators won't let them, frankly. A lot of it, and this gets to your question, is because there's a misperception that electric vehicles, electric transportation is sort of a luxury good that's not for these people.
Right. They have
it's
the perception of it, right?
Yeah, and I mean it's sort of like you're seeing a similar evolution in solar of no, this shouldn't just be for wealthy folks in the suburbs who want to put solar on their roof. We need models for community solar. So I say that all because one of the things we've run into a lot, especially early on, is a lot of well-meaning folks in our world who will say, yes, we need to center equity in transportation, electrification, and so that means let's electrify the transit system. Well, that's a good thing to do. It's really important, makes a lot of sense. And when you immediately go there, you've just reinforced two stereotypes, right, that are not helpful. One is that only low-income folks would ever ride the bus. I rode the bus to work this morning. I do all the time. We need to break that. But second of all, that electric vehicles, electric cars are not for low-income folks.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the extreme case of that among a lot of my environmental friends is, oh, well, cars are not for low-income folks.
Just cars.
Yeah, of any kind.
Of any kind,
like,
right.
These are transit-dependent populations, and I'll just say, frankly, for some of the environmental folks we work with, they want it that way. I've literally had people say to me, well, the last thing you'd want to do is take somebody who is commuting on a bus and put them in an electric car. And to which I just said, well, first of all, that's the most arrogant, condescending thing I've heard all year. But second of all, you're talking about, in some cases, folks who have 3 transfers and an hour and a half bus ride to get to and from work, and then they have to figure out how to get groceries on the bus. And if you could turn that into a 20-minute car trip, and by the way, in Portland at least, the bus costs $5 or $6 a day.
That's good. Add up.
The electric car could be $20 or $30 a month. So if it's cheaper and it's faster, and we already told you the biggest way to get out of poverty is to reduce your commute time, absolutely we should be getting those folks off the bus. So all of that said,
these are all perceptions though, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's some grounding for that. Like any technology, especially when it first started, electric vehicles did start more expensive, but it's less and less true every year. So you were asking about models. So we do a lot of work around electric vehicle car sharing, for example.
Right.
And again, a lot of these folks I'm talking about love that idea. Lots of people love electric car sharing as a concept.
Before you go a little deeper into that, because you're in Portland, they have all this cool stuff in Portland, okay?
Yeah.
So what is electric, how does that work? What is electric car sharing?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked, because when we started doing this for the first time in community about 10 years ago, the first response we got was, oh yeah, car sharing, we do that all the time. I share with my cousin and my brother and the folks at church. So it's a cultural, need to translate. It's a thing. So this is a formal, organized version of that. And so basically we work with mostly affordable housing providers and apartment complexes, places like that, where we will help them install charging and locate a couple of electric cars that can be rented by the hour, and typically very cheaply. So maybe $4 or $5 an hour. You can rent an electric car, and it's
one bus ride. You said.
Well, and so people really like this idea because, again, there's and some of it, frankly, is because of this misperception of, oh, well, low-income folks can't afford cars, and will never have electric cars, so this is a way for them to benefit without having to own one. It is really helpful for folks who don't have access to a car, for example, to run to the grocery store, or a medical appointment, or another kind of shopping or appointment that they need to get to. It can also be really helpful in an emergency. Again, something that well-meaning, fairly affluent folks don't necessarily think about is your car breaks down. In a lot of cases, for a lot of lower income folks, if your car breaks down, you can't make it to work, you could be fired for that. Or you could face major economic impacts. You got to rush out and repair your car, and that's money you didn't have saved up. The consequences are huge. Whereas, if I go out in the morning and my car won't start, I can just work from home that day, right?
Yes,
Or take a vacation day, worst case. So it's really helpful for a lot of use cases. It's also a great, one of our other partners called it sourdough starter, because you see people in your neighborhood using this technology, benefiting from this technology. Ideally, we try and partner with the people who manage the housing so that they're using the vehicles.
Oh,
So
nice.
you see people you trust using this. You can try it yourself pretty cheaply. And then you can decide, oh, maybe I want to buy one for myself. And we always overbuild the charging. So if there's 2 cars, there's probably 4 charging ports. And so you know you'll have a place to charge it if you do buy one. So that's an example that's pretty innovative that we're seeing more and more communities experimenting with around the country.
Okay. I'm going to ask we're talking about buying an EV, right? And I'm just going to ask a question that really has, I mean, it deals with equity, but it's also really about accessing it for anyone. So some of the barriers that I've seen and heard about are, but they've talked about range anxiety, right? And what
Right.
I learned was that, and I didn't know this helped me, is that over 90% of the driving happens within a 30-mile radius. Like,
Exactly.
okay, so that's not too much anxiety around that. But every year there's like the range gets longer and longer, and people are waiting, right? You know what I mean? That technology, the next technology, kind of like the iPhone or the phone.
Yep.
Is that happening? Is that a barrier that's still happening in the EV world, which is preventing people?
Yeah, I mean, so if I back up, I would say the first barrier is just basic information. Most Americans have never seen an electric car, have never driven an electric car. Still.
Wow.
And particularly once you're out of the bubbles, right? Like, one of my favorite sci-fi writers has this quote: "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed." So, if you're in downtown Portland or Boulder, Colorado, you might think, "Oh, everybody knows about electric cars." Not true. Once you get out of those areas, and even in our communities, not true for low-income communities, people of color, rural communities. And that's not where these vehicles have been marketed. The communications have, again, been around, this is not for you. This is not for people like you. You don't see people like you in the advertisements. So there's a whole bunch of factors there. So the first thing is we have to let people know, this is the technology, this is what's here, this is what it can do, this is what its range is, this is what it costs, right? So you can buy... there are a lot of good used electric vehicles on the market for less than $20,000.
Really?
That are 2 or 3 years old. And then right now, at least, there's a $4,000 federal rebate or tax credit for those used electric cars. A lot of states have incentives. So just that basic information. So that's first. The second is what I would call charging anxiety. I don't think it's range anxiety, because most people who don't have an electric car, they don't know how long they drive. They don't know what the range of the vehicle is. They don't know where the charging stations are.
That's right.
They don't know how you charge. It's all intimidating if you've never done it, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's a poll that was done in England a few years ago, not that long ago, that said something like half of drivers didn't know if you could take your electric car through the car wash.
Ooh.
Right? Think about it. Electricity and water, we keep telling people, is a bad mix. So it's a reasonable question. Like, what happens when it rains and I'm plugging the car in? Am I going to get zapped? No, you're not. But all of those things.
I didn't even think of that.
People, hopefully I didn't give you another reason not to. But, people need to understand, how does charging work and how is it going to work for me? Can I charge at home? Can I charge at work? Can I charge in public? All of that. And then there's issues around vehicle cost and access. So what does the car cost? Can I get a loan for it? Can I find those vehicles in my community from the places that I'm used to shopping for a car? Is the right kind of vehicle available, right? Until recently, there weren't any electric pickup trucks. So if you need a truck, or you think you need a truck, you want a truck, you didn't have a good option.
Right.
And there's still not a lot of those on the used market yet. There will be in a few years. But,
Okay.
so like right now, if you're a landscape contractor and you want a pickup truck, it's probably not a good electric option for you, especially if you're a small business, with not a lot of money.
Right. Or if you have recently I tried to convince somebody who hauls a boat, right, to say, hey, to consider an electric truck, and there's like there's no electric vehicle that can haul this boat of mine. So
Yeah.
maybe
Well,
it
it depends
is.
how far you want to haul it. Yeah. And we try really hard not to oversell
Yeah.
because, again, especially if you're talking about historically underserved communities, these folks have been sold a lot of stories for a
Yeah.
lot of years, right? So, and actually, we try not to be the ones selling them on anything. We try and partner with folks in the community who are trusted and have those relationships.
Nice.
And then say, well, here's what we know. We know electric vehicles. We don't know the lived experience of your community and what might or might not work for them. So you need to tell us how this might be helpful. If I can, I'm talking a lot, but can I give you another example that I love to cite about that?
Yeah, please do.
So when we first
You're
started
talking
doing
a lot because I'm interviewing you, so I want to hear you talk. So just keep on going.
when we first started doing the electric car sharing work about 10 years ago, we were working in a neighborhood of Portland that's the most diverse neighborhood in town. Lot of non-English speakers, a lot of immigrants. And at that point in time in Oregon, you couldn't get a driver's license if you weren't documented, if you didn't have legal status in the country. And that was a large percentage of folks in this neighborhood. And so they came back to us and said, well, this car share thing is kind of cool, but a lot of us can't drive. We can't get a driver's license, or for other reasons, we've never learned to drive. What do you have for us? And it was a real aha moment for us because we had been doing work on electric bikes from our founding. I'm a big cyclist. We're in Portland. Makes sense. But it was very much, how do we use this technology to get more people to ride bikes?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do we get
Get
more
used to, I mean, even
suburban
just-
commuters to choose bikes? And suddenly it was like, oh, well, wait a minute. This could actually be core transportation for real people. And so we designed a project where we loaned electric bikes to low-income communities of color, folks who were trying to get to community college or wherever they needed to go, to see how this might work for them. So it's like, well, we have these bikes. You don't need a driver's license. Could this work?
Right.
And so we tested that and learned a ton. People really love them. They're still expensive. At that point, and still, a decent electric bike might set you back $2,000 or $3,000, which
Right.
a lot cheaper than a car, but still a lot of money.
Still a piece of change. Yeah.
And we also learned things like, well, most of these apartment buildings that folks live in are 3 stories tall, because that's how tall you can get before you legally need an elevator. And if you're living on the 3rd floor, you can't really haul an e-bike up 3 flights of stairs, and there's no safe bike parking. And even if there was safe bike parking, there's no outlets there to charge your e-bike. So it led to some changes locally. For example, the bicycle parking code for the city of Portland started to include requirements for electrical outlets so that you
Oh,
can charge your
okay.
e-bike in the bike parking if you have bike parking.
Yeah.
Some other things like that. So
Yeah. It's a great
very-
way, I would say, also to get people thinking about electric anything, right? So, like, if you start on a bike, right, and especially young folks, if it is, or then you're like, you could see yourself getting, when time is right, into a car that you don't have that big thing like, how do you plug in? How do you charge? Or all those things that you've said.
Yeah.
It's like you called it the sourdough starter. It could be
Yeah.
a starter to bigger purchase, right, down the road.
Yeah, and I think it's also a really great example of that kind of curb cut approach because honestly, how do I say this? So there's this expression in the cycling world, mammal, middle-aged man in lycra. That's me, right? So I'm a hardcore cyclist. I was the guy who back in the day when would ride his bike to work and chain it to a dumpster behind the building or like sneak it into his office, would take paper towels into the bathroom and clean up right? But if you really want people to bike, you need safe bike parking and showers and lockers and all of that. But it's sort of a similar thing of if you really want people to use bicycles for transportation, to get to work, to buy groceries, etc. For most people, that's going to be an electric bike, right? Because, I'm the guy who has taken my regular bicycle and brought home a gallon of milk, a couple bottles of wine, a pizza strapped across the back, right? Most people are not going to do that.
I've tried that. It's really not that.
Yeah, it's not that fun. And so part of what we learned in this project is like, yeah, if you can get electric bikes into people's hands, they can travel the 5 miles to community college and back, and they can do it much more easily than on the bus. But they're not going to ride a regular bike to do that.
Right.
It's just not going to work. And so we got to overcome the barriers for them to use electric bikes. And then the more people are using those bikes, the more support there'll be for better bike lanes and infrastructure.
Yes,
and
exactly.
all the other things.
Right. That to me is a great case study, what you just said, right? For an equitable case study on how to help with perhaps low income folks that have to do everything that everybody else has to do, right? Get the groceries, pick up the whatever that is, to be able to, have that option of the bikes.
Can I, and just to put a final maybe coda on that I think is part of the story I don't always tell. In the course of this project, one of the bikes got stolen. And our first reaction was, oh, well, we're like, these bikes are being loaned to us as part of this project. Like, we got to file a police report so we can claim insurance, yada, yada, yada. And luckily, we have really good partners because we knew from the beginning we need partners in the community who are trusted, who have the lived experience. And one of them said, hey, time out. You've put a bunch of people of color on these e-bikes driving around town. If you now put out a police report that says somebody stole one of these bikes, let's just think for a minute about how this is going to play out.
I love that.
As police start pulling over every person of color they see on one of these e-bikes.
Right.
And how that might end for those folks. And it was, again, one of these learning moments where it's like, oh, that's not the path we want to go down.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was a reminder of how important it is to have that cultural competence or work with folks who do have it.
Yes.
And of the kind of changes that we needed to make as an organization. And just, again, to sort of ground yourself in what does life look like for these folks you're trying to help. And that takes me back to the point about cars, because the truth is, leaving aside, we're not talking about the very lowest income, people experiencing homelessness, et cetera. But for low income working people, they almost all rely on cars. And again, unless you're in New York City or some outliers. And the difference is, and those cars are really expensive for them, not because they were expensive to buy, but maybe they spent $1,000 to buy it, but they're spending $1,000 a month
of their income, right? That and we call energy burden, right? This is
exactly.
a transportation burden, right?
Exactly right, and it's fuel, repairs, anxiety over, again, if that car breaks down and they suddenly need to put another $500 into it.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things that can drive people to get behind on their bills and eventually wind up homeless and all those terrible outcomes. And so we need to ground ourselves in that experience and say, if you could take somebody who has that cheap car, but it's costing them $1,000 a month to keep it running, and instead get them into a car that costs them $30 a month to fuel and keep running, and figure out how do you deal with the upfront cost. But that is life changing.
Yeah.
And particularly populations that have to drive a lot for their work. Like, we work a lot with Uber and Lyft drivers or other gig food delivery workers, etc. We work increasingly with folks who are doing jobs that require them to drive a lot. And again, just the potential benefits are huge.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's the nuances of all of this, right? That you have to pay attention to. And if it's not in your world, you can skip right over it and say, what a great idea. But wait a minute, let's think this out. So thank you for saying that story. I'm going to just do a pivot as we begin to wrap up. I'm leaving the juiciest question for last.
Okay.
So here we go. Right. Well, it's going to take massive investments in our infrastructure as well, right, to do this, as it is true for our energy system as well. And up until recently, that looked pretty promising, right? There was a lot of money coming in, and then if things change, to say that with any administration, there's always changes. So not to point a finger on any particular one, but here we are in this moment. How do you see the recent political developments affecting EV adoption and accessibility, right, around the whole equity piece?
Yeah. Well, it's to state the obvious, it's not good. It's a bit of a double whammy, right, on the transportation electrification front and on the equity and access front. So one thing that unfortunately we see happen, well, let me back up a little bit and say, on transportation electrification, it is clear that everything that moves is becoming electric. That's true globally. You look at the percentage of vehicles in Asia, in Europe, even in the US, EV sales are growing double digits. It's over 10% of new car sales already. No policy change, much less tweet, is going to stop that reality. It will, however, make it a lot bumpier. It'll slow it down a lot. It'll make it very unclear what kind of role it is making it unclear what kind of role the U.S. auto industry is going to be able to play in that. As one of the automakers we work with a lot was telling me recently, it's like, we'll still be around. We're just going to be a lot smaller, and we're only going to sell in the U.S. If you follow all of these policies to their natural conclusion, because the rest of the world is going to be buying electric vehicles, and if we can't compete in selling them those, we are
still going to be behind, and that's true for our, for clean energy.
So, I think what we're seeing is the vehicle companies are still committed because they have to be if they want to survive. It's going to be much more focused in a smaller number of states and regions.
Okay.
Like, again, Back to the Future is not evenly distributed. If you look at a map of the U.S. right now of EV sales, what percentage of new car sales are electric? It's basically West Coast, Northeast, and a few islands like Colorado, Chicago, Michigan area. And so what we're going to see is a bigger separation, to keep beating this analogy, right? Like, some of those places are going to continue to get years ahead of other places, rural parts of America, middle America, et cetera.
Okay.
Which is really unfortunate. My hope is that those areas will develop tools and models and figure some things out so that the rest of the country can move faster when it's ready to.
Okay.
But so that's what's happening on the electrification front. On the sort of equity and access front, first of all, it's a little bit similar, right? So some of those states are going to remain committed. Most states still have some level of requirement for utilities to be focused on low and moderate income customers. In a lot of cases, that'll continue to grow into transportation, not just traditional energy. I think, all of that said, there's a little bit of a silver lining in this, which is in both cases, I think we're being forced to do some work as a community that we should have done already, which is to kind of show our work. So when we talk about equity, for example, again, I find over the last several years especially, a lot of folks have gotten kind of sloppy, right? You could just throw around acronyms about, well, we center BIPOC community,
Yes.
and let's be honest, often the people saying those things didn't even know what they meant by them, right? Much less the people hearing them. It's like either it sounds good or it sounds bad, but you don't, based on your politics and ideology, but you don't really know what it means. And I have had a lot of conversations with folks who start out saying, I am allergic to DEI, I'm totally opposed. And then you start talking to them, you're like, well, so do you think we should, help folks who have more barriers to accessing the technology be able to access it? It's like, well, yeah, absolutely, we should do that, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So break it down, show your work, bring people with you.
Meet them where they are, right?
Meet them where they are. And the same thing on transportation electrification. Nobody buys a car because they want to hug a polar bear or they care about climate change.
Even though those early commercials did.
Yes, you remember that commercial.
I do. I used to make fun of it all the time.
People buy a car because it does what they want it to do. It has the features they want.
Right.
It's affordable to them, makes them feel cool, makes them feel righteous. So eventually they're on that list with yes, I also want to feel like I'm not destroying the planet. I don't want to be embarrassed by my car. But that's somewhere on the list, but it's not the first thing.
That's right.
And so why have we been selling this as a climate change strategy as opposed to these are better cars, they're more fun to drive, they're cheaper to operate, they're more reliable. I mean, there's all these other benefits. So
totally. You can pass the gas station.
Yeah, so I think it's healthy for us. My board president keeps reminding me, this is how diamonds get made, Jeff, right? Like, a lot of heat and pressure the next few years.
To your point, Jeff, that there was a lot of money that came in, right, into the whole clean energy, billions of dollars that came in, and billions of people jumped on that, got on the bandwagon, and then things change, and you see the withdrawal that's happening, which leaves often the people, the organizations, the communities that are dedicated to it, right, and are going to press this forward no matter what.
A lot of folks who jumped in the last 3 years will jump back out again, and those of us who were EV when EV wasn't cool will still be here doing the work. And I'm hopeful, like I say, that the way I would put it is, it's going to force us to kind of do our homework, show our work, sharpen our pencils, whatever analogy you want to use, to be clearer about why this is such a great idea, why this is so important, why people should support it. And again, it's never been something that should be ideological or partisan or political.
Right. And move away from that, actually. It's a messaging issue. As a marketer, I say that. Just get real with it. So I want to thank you so much for being on today. You've made me feel more positive, actually, on where it's all going. And how could people learn more about Forth and what you do?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I feel like we could go on for hours.
I know. Maybe we have to do a part 2 to this.
We could do that. So our website is Forth Mobility, Forth mobility.org, and we have a free email newsletter and webinars and best practice papers, lots of free resources there. Awesome. And then we put on a big conference every year called the Forth Roadmap Conference. and that will be in Detroit this year, October 14th through 16th. And more information about that is at roadmapforth.org. And I should highlight, again, consistent with our values, we have mobility for all scholarships for community-based organizations working on these issues. So people should definitely check that out, and we don't want cost to be a barrier.
Thank you. So you really walk the walk. So thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on today and joining us. And thank you for tuning in to Just Power. This would be a great show to share with maybe a legislator or a senator, congressman, maybe even your energy provider. Because the time is now, right now, to create sustainable and equitable energy and mobility that leaves no one behind. Because we're all in this together. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to Just Power wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really loved it, leave us a review and tell everyone you know about our podcast. It's going to take all of us to create a clean energy future that leaves no one behind.